How's it going, OFPs? And welcome to another episode of the Off-Field Players Podcast. I'm your host, Phillip, and today I actually have a guest in my on the show today. He's a well-known guy. You've probably seen him on the vlogs from my personal channel. If you follow that, make sure you go subscribe to my personal channel under Phillip Hall. And so I got my buddy Thomas Cavanagh here, sports director here at WSU Sports Radio. And just kind of a surveyor of the studio as well. And Tom, how you doing today, man?
It's a pleasure to talk with you, Phil. But I do have to say we've got a little bit of a slow news day. It might be difficult for us to arrange to get through some topics, but I don't know. We might have something going down the filing line here.
Yeah, I mean, we just got some very polarizing news in regards to our basketball program here, and it's actually a discussion in regards to what we're going to discuss on this episode today of the Off-Field Players Podcast. And yeah, there's a lot of big news, and I don't know if anybody's checked Twitter recently or has looked at their phone all in like the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but it has been officially confirmed that St. John's have hired Rick Pitino as the new head basketball coach here at St. John's University. So how about that? Rick Pitino is officially the coach, the new coach of St. John's, just after the firing of Mike Anderson. That's a couple weeks ago. And he's coming, Tom. He's coming.
It's officially a huge day on campus. I have to consider that this is probably the biggest day of St. John's basketball in the past 30 years. You can definitely make that case. To get someone like Rick Pitino to lead the program, it's been speculated, it's been discussed for weeks, but we finally have some closure here. Rick Pitino will be the head coach of the St. John's Red Storm. 6-year contract is what is being said here, according to Zach Braziller of the New York Post. So Rick Pitino, 70 years of age, still has it, was in the NCAA Tournament with Iona this year. 2 of the last 3 years with Iona, gave UConn a bit of a scare in that first half to definitely show that he can still coach. He's going to be here for the next 6 years at St. John's. It doesn't feel real, Phil. It does not feel real at all. It's just been a turbulent past 30 minutes here, just finding out the news and the radio station. It's been a bit of celebratory here, but I feel like as people start to look at their phones, check their notifications, you're going to start to see a lot of the campus really start to perk up as the day goes along.
Yeah, and some perking up is definitely what St. John's definitely needs right now. And we feel that with this hire of Pitino, it's actually going to do a lot of what will be discussed in this episode because, it is March and the March Madness is going on. A lot of big games have been taking place. And, if your bracket hasn't been busted already, then good for you, I guess I can say. But the hiring of Rick Pitino is really, in a way, kind of overdue, especially with just his success that he's had over at Louisville and his recent success over at Iona, just a couple boroughs north of us up in New Rochelle. And and he got Iona to the tournament, and he lost in the first round to UConn. But I kind of do want to just touch a little bit on the games here going into the discussion. But I remember when I was watching that UConn-Iona game, and I called it the Pitino preview game because it was a good test to see how Rick Pitino can coach against a Big East school, especially a Big East school as talented as UConn. And, and I feel like with him coming to St. John's, he's going to help bring, and, of course, with you and me being seniors, unfortunately, we won't be able to kind of experience it as students, but, as alum, we can always come back and, support St. John's in basketball still. But, with Pitino getting hired, we're going to see an increase in, better recruiting, more money being put towards the facilities because, believe me, St. John's does need a facelift when you look at Carnesecca Arena. And even, ticket sales, we're trying to pack out more games at Madison Square Garden when we play our home games there, like later on in the season against Big East conference opponents, and just even huge on NIL. So I'm sure the players should be a lot more happy about this too. And transfer portal is probably going to be really crazy, and we're definitely going to work in St. John's' favor during the offseason.
No, absolutely, Phil. And you saw that with that Iona team, with the talent that Pitino was able to accrue, even at a very small school like Iona in the conference of the MAAC, the two A's in the middle, where you're not going to be able to get that much talent. I mean, we saw that last year with the whole story about St. Peter's and, the discrepancy in resources that they had in their major Cinderella run that they had in the very same conference. You're not really going to be able to convince many high-level recruits to come to Iona, but for Rick Pitino, like, the level of talent at Iona really rivals some of even the top mid-major schools that you maybe see in the Atlantic 10 or the Mountain West Conference. I mean, for crying out loud, Iona, they beat the brakes off of St. Louis by 20 on their own home court this season. And St. Louis was a really great Atlantic 10 team. I believe they were in the A10 semifinals this year in their tournament. So again, Rick Pitino, he's always going to be able to be a great recruiter. He is going to be able to know his talent as well and being able to coach the talent to at least improve them beyond the sum of their parts. And I think we're going to see that on an amplified scale now that he's in the Big East. He's going to have big resources, coaching at St. John's, having the Madison Square Garden behind him, whatever potential practice facility upgrades that they may have on campus that are coming down over the next few years. We don't know, but ultimately I do think that it's going to be an instant impact. I believe next year, St. John's, you can write it down in Sharpie, they're going to be an NCAA tournament team. It doesn't matter. I don't know what their ceiling will be next year since, of course, first year is always very difficult for coaches, even for someone like Rick Pitino and his caliber.
Right.
But I can confidently say with Rick Pitino, he is one of the very few class of coaches that if you had needed a coach, life and death scenario to save your life, to win a game, it would be Rick Pitino.
Yeah, and right now when you look at how St. John's is, especially with our president, Father Shanley, he's sees this program, and this is a president that's a huge advocate for college athletics, especially here at St. John's. So before he was became the school president here, he was the president up at Providence College. And if you've been watching the tournament or you've been following college basketball at all this season, you can see the success that Providence has had. Just as a, I guess, kind of like a top dog in the Big East Conference, really, also a top dog in the top 25 in the national polls. And just seeing how he was able to turn around a small school up there. And mind you, Providence was one of Pitino's last jobs back in the 80s before he took a coaching job to go coach in the NBA with the New York Knicks. So Pitino does have those ties with a few Big East schools in Providence and even in Louisville when they had their short run in the Big East Conference as well. But you also think about just the influence and how St. John's is out like in that win now situation to where they need a coach. And Mike Anderson was a great coach. He's reputable. But it's just when you play in a city like New York, or when you play in a conference like the Big East Conference, it's competitive nonstop, and especially with the staff that we have on end, like Father Shanley, Mike Craig, our athletic director. Mike Craig came from Duke. He was there the whole time when Coach K was there, and he can't spell losing. So, and he really wanted Pitino to be the guy that can help us get St. John's back to his glory days. To be more exact, the Carnesecca days when we were winning all the time. We're in the NCAA tournament consecutively, and St. John's was one of the teams you feared for throughout college basketball. Whenever you went against them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just looking at my phone right now. Adam Zagoria saying that Rick Pitino plans to take his entire Iona Gales coaching staff with him to St. John's. His assistant coaches there. So that also means Steve Masiello, the former Manhattan head coach who jumped onto the Iona coaching staff when he was fired mid-season. I believe that was just because of a contract dispute. It wasn't anything performance-related. That means Steve Masiello likely will be here as an assistant head coach here at St. John's. If you remember, back in 2014, he was set to take the job at South Florida, decided to stay with Manhattan. So it was I think it's going to be big news there, especially for fans that have any kind of concerns about being able to hold down the New York recruiting area. Having a guy like Steve Masiello on staff as your assistant coach is huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing I should mention here is that Thomas is like one of the best college basketball guys I know. Like, expect to see him possibly doing CBS or ESPN talking college basketball.
I hope so. But it really speaks to just how this is just a huge day for St. John's basketball. I know from speaking with alumni, knowing former students, guys like Chris Bello, Michael Zabo, Kevin Connolly, guys that preceded us who have seen these past several years of St. John's basketball, and how kind of dormant this program has been in terms of their relevancy. They have not made the NCAA. They have not won an NCAA tournament game since the year 2000, way before we were born, which is just insane to think about. But for a program like St. John's, knowing of course, the spotted history that Rick Pitino has, of course, you have to acknowledge that. In terms of why maybe even schools like Georgetown, they didn't even approach Rick Pitino, even though Rick Pitino himself said, well, at least the sources were saying that Rick Pitino, he'd be more likely to take the Georgetown job over St. John's if both schools offered him the job. Ultimately, St. John's was in a situation where they were starting to get a little bit desperate, being able to draw some interest for the school. I mean, arguably, I think this pits St. John's into more relevancy than the years with Chris Mullen did. I think even just bringing in an icon like Chris Mullen, I think it pales in comparison to the amount of attention that St. John's is going to be getting. I really do think that as it currently stands, they are going to be the second most relevant basketball team in New York City. Of course, next to their co-tenant in the Knicks, but I think it really just speaks to just how quickly you're going to see St. John's elevate. It's going to be night and day. Yeah, and I think with just the coaching window or the coaching carousel that we've experienced here at St. John's, and even way before we were students, I mean, from 2000, St. John's has gone through Mike Jarvis, Norm Roberts, Steve Lavin, Chris Mullen, who played here back in the 80s when the Big East was, just started getting on the map, especially with those gruesome rivals with our, rival school, Georgetown, and then even, having that experience with Mike Anderson. And I feel like it's a revolving door. And, for the history with St. John's, especially with Lou Carnesecca, legendary coach, he won over 500 games here and got St. John's to a Final Four back in, 85? Back in I think it was 85. That was the same year where they had Georgetown and Villanova in the Final Four. So that was, of course, a consummate year for the Big East. But again, I think you mentioned it too. I think you can kind of see that where the Big East is right now. Like, I think the magic is back. Oh yeah, the magic is back. Absolutely. With realignment. Of course, you're going to losing teams like Syracuse, Pitt, and West Virginia. That always hurts. But I think with the situation that they were dealt with, the cards that Val Ackerman has been dealt, keeping the conference together like this and building kind of a brand of Big East basketball where, of course, you're going to have teams that hate each other for those 20 games of the regular season and into the Big East tournament. But within non-conference play and March Madness, the conference is united. Oh, yeah, and I think so. And I think up until today, of course, with the news about Providence coach Ed Cooley moving to Georgetown and Georgetown poaching Ed Cooley, yeah, wow. You didn't find out about that? I'm just hearing. You're just hearing about this now? Oh, yeah. That I was going on to that point where it was kind of in 2014 where the conference really wanted to embrace some unity between the schools, saying we have to stick together. We can't be at each other's necks. We can't be stepping over each other or poaching coaches. That kind of trust has been – that kind of handshake agreement just got broken with the hiring by Georgetown of Ed Cooley. Of course, that's been in the makings for the past couple of weeks, but the way it's been handled out publicly where it just became kind of Ed Cooley saying something else, and then you see behind the scenes where, you know, he's meeting with Georgetown at their university. He is, you know, speaking, I believe, on their local news channel last night. It was crazy. And then even just this morning where he had his house posting on Zillow of his Providence house, the one that was featured in the little documentary episode that he did with Clark Kellogg on Fox Sports, where he talked about how much Providence meant to him as a hometown school for him and how he wants to stay there for so many years. The irony is very thick there. And I do think that you're going to see, you know, the Big East in terms of the intensity of rivalries really pick up. But you also might really see just kind of the trust between like schools like Georgetown and Providence completely wither.
Yeah, and Thomas, you know, just knowing that you're, you know, fill-in guest for today, you know, the one thing that we emphasize here on the Off Field Players podcast, especially to the OFPs that are listening in or that tune in to come across this episode later on, is that this is just encouraging people to, you know, learn about the sports industry and they're trying to work in it and, you know, trying to build a career for it, and especially with, you know, and there was one, and I did want to get an episode out last week, but actually had some other stuff to do as far as job reviews. Like, mind you, I am a senior, so like I am going in that part of my college career where, you know, I'm starting to, you know, look for employment. And if anybody is listening to this podcast and wants to hire me, hey, I'm still free.
Please hire Phil.
Yeah, and Thomas too.
He's very talented.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but I feel like with just the administration side of the Big East, and, you know, like the episode that I wanted to put out last week was to talk about my experience at the Big East Conference Tournament. So, you know, before March Madness, me and Thomas had the opportunity to broadcast 2 St. John's games for the Big East tournament at Madison Square Garden. You know, Thomas called the first round game when we beat Butler. Then I called the quarterfinal game when we lost to Marquette. But just seeing the atmosphere of it and knowing how much media was inside the Garden for that whole weekend, and, you know, even Ed Cooley said himself that the Big East Conference puts on the best conference tournament than any other conference in college basketball across the country, and I believed him. And yeah, and like from what I've experienced, what me and Thomas experienced when we were at the Garden for the Big East tournament, yeah, it does show like how like massive and just how involved the Big East Conference is, especially when it comes to competition, with marketing, you know, business administration, and everything else that's involved with why the conference is so fun to watch and so fun to work with. And yeah, you know, and just hearing things like that where Val Ackerman doesn't want any collusion happening among the coaches and wants there to still be unity among all the schools in the Big East Conference. I mean, yeah, I feel like that is very valid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a testament to Val Ackerman's vision of the conference and how to survive in this landscape of college sports where football money is going to trump everything.
Absolutely.
It's, you know, of course, conference realignment has just been dominated by television rights deals and, you know, what makes sense for getting the most eyeballs on television screens, because, you know, you're going to be starting to see, you know, the traditional rivalries between teams being torn apart. USC and UCLA going to the Big Ten. Of course, it makes sense if you want to say you want to draw a big money matchup, like, say, USC versus Michigan, but it just does not make sense in terms of the logistics and just the traditions between these teams. You know, we're losing the matchups between USC and Stanford, USC and Cal, UCLA and Stanford, USC and Cal, all those schools, as well as Arizona and those schools down there. So it's a very strong testament, of course, as I mentioned, towards Val Ackerman's vision of the conference, being able to keep it cohesive and keep a similar image of a basketball-only conference,
right.
Something that isn't going to be torn apart by football and something that can last long for many years beyond where we currently stand. And I think ultimately with the state of college basketball, you know, there's so much, you know, so many questions about, is NIL going to ruin college basketball? Is the transfer portal going to ruin college basketball? I still think that college basketball right now, as we currently stand, is in a very good spot. I think it is in a very good spot. Of course, conference realignment makes it a little bit tricky now. with some schools where, we're maybe hearing rumblings of UConn maybe moving to the ACC because they want to parlay their newfound football success, which I think it's kind of modest, if you want to consider it. But for UConn, being able to get to a bowl game like this year is absolutely huge for them. And I'm sure they probably want to, be able to hitch their wagon onto football if they can get some sustainability with that. But again, that's kind of up in the air. Nothing's really – it's all just smoke and mirrors right now, whatever rumors there are about UConn. But as it currently stands with the basketball-only schools like Georgetown, Villanova, St. John's, it's a very, very good nest egg for the Big East Conference. Just being able to have those schools, being able to have Georgetown become relevant again, being able to have St. John's become relevant again. It just shows you that it doesn't have to always just be about football in college sports.
Yeah. And I feel like with that, that's actually the perfect segue of what I wanted to talk about in today's episode, because and for those that are watching or listening, if your school made it to March Madness, congratulations, because there's a lot of benefits for a program to just be able to make the tournament. And even from all the upsets that have been happening, we're looking at schools like Princeton, Fairleigh Dickinson, Furman, knocking out big dog teams in the tournament, and just knowing that like the impact that a school going far in March Madness can have on just the finances and just the marketing and even the recruiting side. This is where college basketball and the NCAA tournament is like the beautiful combination. And just to give you some numbers here, just knowing that with college football is still going to trump everything that happens in college athletics, from the competition and the financial side and even the conference alignments. But we also have to factor in that March Madness is still the big money driver for the NCAA, especially with the the TV deals and even just the amount of revenue that's generated for per game. It was actually mentioned in 2021 that we're here looking at this article. March Madness accounted for 85% of the organization's $1.16 billion revenue. And even, you look at the TV contracts that the NCAA is getting from networks like CBS or Turner Sports. It's a 22-year contract worth $20 billion. So, just that flip around between channels while you're watching all the games, you can see where the production is coming from and how the money's getting made.
Yeah, and I think the NCAA, they have a money-making, I guess it's more of a, bit of a part of the system for March Madness, where it's, of course, tournament win units, right, which is a huge part of the revenue generated by these low major conferences. And you hear the discussion about people when they say, oh, why don't we just move all of the, last eight at-large teams into the first four and just have all of the, at the auto bid low major conference champions into the field of 64. And the reason for that is because of what those first four wins can really mean for these schools. You want to look at a school like Fairleigh Dickinson, for example, and the revenue that they generated from their tournament wins for their conference, the NEC Conference. If you all know anything about the NEC Conference in terms of college basketball, it is statistically the worst conference in college basketball. You can look up on KenPom. They are ranked dead last in the country, 32nd overall. And they've kind of have some very turbulent financials. Just today, an hour before this show, St. Francis Brooklyn announced that they are shutting down their athletics program in the NEC Conference. Wow. So that just shows you just how kind of perilous of a spot it can be for schools like that, and for schools like Fairleigh Dickinson as well. As a 16 seed, they needed to get a win over Texas Southern to get into the field of 64. And even if just getting that win for them is crucial for not just them, but the conference as a whole in terms of the budget, because I believe there is a certain six-figure number, I believe, in terms of the value for tournaments, the win units. And that is paid out over the next 6 years. So every 6 years, the NEC Conference is going to get a roughly six-figure amount of money. And for a conference like the NEC, as you just saw with St. Francis Brooklyn, that's pretty huge.
Yeah, and you also have to factor in with all the money that's being redistributed by the NCAA as far as, like purse earnings. What's also, a part of that that system is the redistribution among conferences. So, like, say, for example, St. John's is in the Big East Conference. Even though St. John's didn't make the tournament this year, we had 5 representatives come from our conference in Creighton, Xavier, Marquette, Providence, and UConn. And, UConn has gone pretty far. Marquette, they went to the second round. And, even Providence made the first round. And even just depending on how far these schools go, because, like, in years past, we've had schools like Villanova make it to the Final Four, like win the national title for the Big East Conference. Or even, like a few other big schools like Marquette, they've had some good runs here. UConn, like, historically has always been, like a big winner in the Big East Conference. And that has helped out. And, like, believe it or not, like, those schools making it to the tournament has actually helped out St. John's in a lot of ways because that once that money gets redistributed, say if, a team like UConn or Villanova wins the title, like that money gets redistributed back into the conference. And the Big East is an 11-school conference. And each school is going to get a piece of that, whether or not that school made the tournament.
Yeah, and a school like Fairleigh Dickinson, you saw, that win over Purdue, how much a win like that can mean for a school. I've gotten to know a kid named Jordan Sarnoff at a Bruce Beck sports broadcasting camp back in 2018, 2019. He's a great guy. He went to Fort Lee High School just across the river in New Jersey. They call him Bridgeman in honor of the mascot name of Fort Lee High School. He was a great SID there at Fort Lee, great PA announcer there as well. He went to Fairleigh Dickinson. He is now the sports information director there. And if you know anything about sports information directors, that's a pretty huge job. You are basically the media coordinator for the athletics program. You're basically working with media, being able to print out the guides, the notes, all of this stuff. You're in control of media availability, scheduling interviews, the whole 9 yards. And this guy is a junior in college doing that. And I want to shout out Jordan here on the show. And it just shows you, though, just the disparity in resources that can be shown at these universities where, for a school like Fairleigh Dickinson, they are giving the sports information director job to a college student that is currently also dealing with midterms and other exams as well, not just to also go with the amount of just the insane amount of work that comes with being an SID.
Yeah, and OFPs, let that be like a motivation to you. Just know, like, it doesn't matter how young you are. Like, if the opportunity ever comes, like, be able to take it because, just the motivation like that, and even just finding yourself. Because sometimes, like, what we have to understand as off-field players is that the timing is not always going to be perfect. And that's something that I'm starting to learn as I'm going through the application process, and as Thomas is going through the application process. It's that timing's not always going to be your friend, and it's just something you have to adapt to be able to have, not so much fall into these positions, but still be able to understand that it's going to take time. And, it could come like when you're a junior in college, or it could come like when you're 30. Like, it's just, it's just a part of the industry, that really. But yeah, and I feel like with a conference like the NEC and like a school like Fairleigh Dickinson, this is something that they needed. And then just even find out about the news about St. Francis shutting down
programs. That's Brooklyn. That's insane because
like the timing couldn't have been like the school just one school from their conference has practically helped them. Possibly could have helped them put more money back in their pocket
and put the spotlight on them. And then you have a school like St. Francis Brooklyn, who's been playing Division I college basketball since 1901, shutting down their program, not just moving to the Division III level like Hartford did, in terms of being able to save up on scholarships. They flat out cut it. They flat out cut out athletics. And I think, it had to do with them moving their campus in Brooklyn. They had to move out of their gym. The gym that they were using, I believe it was a separate gym. It wasn't like, of course they had to move out of their Division I gym. I think it was a gym used by some high schools. It was so it was a very like temporary, solution for them. But I don't know if how long this has been hurtling toward, like how long this has been going, like in terms of how, St. Francis Brooklyn's athletics downfall was going. Because this was also sudden. Of course, you see how, like, if you want to look at, their athletics programs haven't been very successful, but, they've had schools in New York City. I think a school in New York City, they should at least have some interest. They should have, in terms of some level of brand recognition, even for a school as small as St. Francis Brooklyn is. They only have a 2,000 student enrollment, which is insane. And roughly 500 of those students are athletes. So you're going to see a bunch of students moving all around the country because of this. And a lot of not just students, a lot of people working in the athletics department, a lot of people now that are going to be without jobs. And that, I mean, I know it sounds like, well, it's just St. Francis Brooklyn. They're just small potatoes. I mean, there's going to be a lot of people affected by this.
Yeah, and I just think, and I feel like that's, in a way, kind of a precedent for like a school to be able to deal with that. Because in the past we've had there have been college programs that have just flat out just just trying to dig their own graves, and knowing that they don't have the resources to be able to stay alive or at least keep their programs going. And it does hurt people that are working for these schools, and even for the student athletes as well, that are going to have to transfer to another school and hoping that they can even find a spot on a roster somewhere else, especially with just the freedom that student athletes have these days with the transfer portal and all the NIL deals that come with it. And even, I think about, people that are working in the athletic department just as, employees, and just knowing that their jobs are going to get cut because of this. And even when we obviously know the challenges of trying to find a job in the sports industry, especially in today's economy, and just knowing that the window is relatively small for you to land somewhere else, depending on how qualified you are for that particular position. But it definitely is a big concern right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And college athletics, especially at a private Catholic school, you're going to see a lot of Catholic schools. They're always going to be looking to balance their budgets, being able to kind of manage, so many different kind of revenue streams. We even saw it right here at St. John's. They're shutting down the Staten Island satellite campus, which is I'd argue it's a little bit of a bigger deal than people are kind of making it out to be, because, that's a bunch of kids that, about maybe 2,000 students there, having to move here to St. John's.
Right.
I mean, it's a lot. But I think with a school like Fairleigh Dickinson, I haven't heard a lot of kind of financial straits that they're on, on the level of St. Francis Brooklyn or Hartford, for example. But you have to admit, this win here against Purdue is going to hold them down for a very, very long time. Their athletic director came out and said this was a game changer for them. Just this one win against Purdue, it's going to completely define their tradition, their donorship, their donor revenue streams, all of this, over the next 15, 20 years, And I know that sounds crazy, but if you want to look at a school like UMBC, they are still remembered more for that 2018 upset win than the team that actually ended up winning the NCAA tournament that season, which was Villanova.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 16 over a 1 seed, that's, unheard of, especially in this day and age. And I think, FDU were the second school ever to upset a 1 seed as a 6
seed. Second school ever.
We should even point out that technically Fairleigh Dickinson wasn't even supposed to be in March Madness, because the way that's set up is that the conference tournament winner of the NEC conference turns out to be Merrimack, who's actually St. John's actually played in our season opener.
First game.
Yeah, it was our first game of the season. We played Merrimack. I called that game, and just knowing going into it, I actually just learned about Merrimack. I didn't know that they were only in their second year because they were moved up from Division II to Division I just recently.
It was just they moved to Division I, I believe, in 2019-2020. They won their regular season title in 2020. They couldn't qualify for the conference tournament, and it eventually got canceled because of COVID. But, they had immediate success, if you want to speak relatively, towards conference expectations and how they're performing. They won their conference championship on their home court, and it didn't even matter for them, which, of course, I'm sure if you're Merrimack right now, you're kicking yourself. But there was nothing really they could do because of the NCAA's rules on the schools transitioning up from Division III to Division I, Division III, Division II, wherever school they're moving up to, because for whatever reason they don't want schools to be moving up and down the order. They want to see if schools are really going to be fully committed to Division I athletics, which I can kind of understand. But at the same time, if you're moving up from Division II to Division I, you're likely good enough already to move to Division I. You want to look at a school like St. Thomas University in, I believe, St. Paul, Minnesota. They moved up from Division III to Division I. They got kicked out of their conference for being too good. They literally got kicked out of their own conference because their athletics teams were too good. And so they ended up accepting a spot in the Summit League of Division I. And right now, of course, they're still kind of struggling to get back into that kind of success that they had at Division III. But right now, if you want to consider this is their third year here in Division I mean, the level of success that they have, I mean, it's pretty good, for a school that's in their third year at Division I.
Yeah, and just to kind of go a little bit more in detail on how Merrimack wasn't able to get to the tournament despite winning their conference. So the NCAA has this rule for if a school gets moved up from either D2 or D3, and this could be because its enrollment increased, or athletics are as successful and the school has a little bit more money endowment. But the one catch of becoming a newly entered D1 team, especially even if you are winning your conference every year, you have really good job recruiting, is that they have to go through a 4-year probation period where even if you are successful in your conference, like you win your conference tournaments, or if you win your conference championship game in football, you still aren't able to compete in postseason play, whether it's going to a bowl game, going to March Madness, for baseball, regionals. You still can't be able to do that because there's those 4-year probation period. And I feel like in a way that hurts a lot of schools, especially now, because you think about all the advancements that have been made in college sports, from NILs, the transfer portal, and even just recruiting, recruiting and NIL, having that combination together. How are you supposed to get a kid coming out of high school that's probably not getting a lot of a buzz from any other schools, but you really want to bring him on scholarship? But the one catch is, even if he does come to your school, he's not going to be able to have as much exposure in the big tournaments, like the big money tournaments.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point, with kids coming in from college, from high school, not being able to play in these tournaments. It's a very interesting way of, how would you be able to motivate kids to play for you at a school knowing that they won't have a chance to play in the NCAA tournament? And honestly, that is a very, very Herculean task, but we've seen some schools really do it. I mean, if you want to look at Merrimack and, the talent that they brought in, I remember that very first game against St. John's. What was his name? I forget his first name, but I definitely remember his last name. It was Derkack, Derkack. He had 14 points in his college debut, and I think he had a very strong season in the NEC. And apparently, he was, from reading from local reporters who cover the NEC, they said that, a guy like him, he's very talented at, for a player here in the NEC. So it's interesting to really see, how would a coach be able to motivate a kid to come play for your school knowing that by the time they graduate, they won't have a chance to play in the NCAA tournament? I don't have any answer for that, and I think that's a good reason why I probably will never be a college head coach. But I do think that, you kind of have to sell them on so many different parts of the experience and, what you can get out of them from coaching. I mean, I think there's a very long list of schools like that haven't been to the NCAA tournament over the past 4 years, past 5 years. Schools that can say, like, we've had kids graduate and they've never gotten a taste of March Madness. But they've been able to sell students on other aspects, whether it's academics, whether it is the campus experience, whether it is a new city, a new town. For a school like Merrimack that's in the suburbs in Massachusetts or in a rural part of New England, I think that's a little bit difficult. I think it's a little bit more difficult than, say, trying to convince a student to come play for maybe a school in New York City. Let's just say hypothetically a school moved up, like say a Delphi, for example. Let's say a Delphi or Pace moved up to Division I. They were left in this kind of, purgatory. If a school I think for a school like a Delphi and schools like Pace, they can really motivate kids to come to play in New York City. Especially if kids, a lot of college students, they want to move somewhere across the country. You were from Oakland, so right. You came all the way across the country to come to New York City. Of course, I stayed home because, of course, I have different motivations. But, of course, you can find a way to motivate the kids that want to play for your program, that want to say, hey, I want to move across the country, or hey, I want to play in a different environment. If you can sell them on that, I think you can still tide yourself over that kind of transition period, which I know it's a very sticky situation. A lot of pundits hate it. A lot of schools, players. Universally, it's a very hated rule, but ultimately you can't really do anything about it right now.
Yeah, and I mean, when I first heard about that, because I discovered that this was a rule when last year when Bellarmine won the ASUN. And, I was like, oh, okay, hey, new D1 school, great story to hear that they won the conference tournament their first year ever as a D1 school, but then finding out that they weren't able to go to the tournament, I was thinking, oh, man, what kind of rule is this? I mean, it shocked me. And, even there was an article that came out of how, players on the basketball team at Bellarmine, they were protesting against this probation rule, just knowing that, some of those guys, they were young. Some of them were freshmen and, some were, upperclassmen, and just knowing that they weren't going to be able to have the experience of playing in March Madness and just knowing the benefits of that can do for a school just making the tournament. I'll say this, some of the effects of a school making it to March Madness, and this dates back to, say, St. Peter's, that run that they had last year going all the way to the Elite Eight. When St. Peter's had that run, it showed an increase in applications, people Googling the school, learning more about, reading up about, and being like, hey, I didn't know about the school, but since they've had this success in basketball, and maybe, people that are doing this research, they probably find something out of that school and would want to go there. So an increase in applicants, revenue increase for donors to come back in, for facilities to be upgraded, improvements to the facilities, of course, and even better recruiting as well. Because that's the one big deal. And like you said, Harry's one of the selling points for a lot of schools, outside of sports, could be academics, the resources that are offered post-graduation, because, we obviously know the numbers of the number of student athletes that are going to have a chance to go play professionally in their sport. I mean, it's a very slim number. But still having that opportunity to be a student athlete, get the greatest academic resources at your school, having the experience of playing college sports and making connections through friendships and the teammates, and even just letting that be something you put on a resume after your college career is over, being like, hey, I was able to pick up leadership skills and be able to learn a few things as a student athlete, and letting that be one of the selling points as you go throughout your career, whatever that is in.
No, absolutely. And, of course, there's always going to be a life after college.
Right.
And even as a college athlete, you might be able to think hey, I can go professionally in my sport. You mentioned it, very slim margin, like very slim probability of that happening.
The number is like, what, 3%?
Very small.
Will go pro?
It is. But I remember the story of Santi Aldama. Of course, he won the lottery. He got into the NBA. He's playing for the Memphis Grizzlies. He was a top 100 recruit. Of course, not exactly a guarantee that he'd be going into the NBA regardless, but nonetheless, he could have picked so many different power conference schools or anything like that. But you know what the one school he picked? It was Loyola University of Maryland, all the way, I believe, in the Patriot League.
Yeah.
So they are about as mid-major as they come. Loyola Maryland Greyhounds, who don't exactly have a very strong basketball tradition there.
They do have good soccer tradition.
They do have we saw them play this year.
Yeah, St. John's playing with soccer this year.
He went to play there, but the reason why he went to play there was because he was in love with – he wanted to go to their business school, which was very highly touted as a top 100 recruit out of Spain. So it's a very interesting way of being able to kind of hedge your bets as a college athlete who, you know, if you get to play at the mid-major level – you know, you can still get an avenue to the NBA while you can also still work on your academics and still work on what you want to do after college. I think of another guy as well. I think his name was I'm thinking the guy from Rutgers. I think it was Miles Young. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I hope that's the right name. It was not Miles. It was not Miles Young. I'm mixing up the two names. It's Miles Johnson. I was thinking of Jacob Young and Miles Johnson from Rutgers. I mixed those two names up. I don't know how I did it, but I did. Anyway, Miles Johnson, he was an engineering student at Rutgers, and he decided to grad transfer to UCLA to join their program for engineering because he wants to become an engineer after college. And he was playing –
What sport?
Basketball. He was playing for the Rutgers basketball team. I believe he grad transferred to UCLA last year. I believe that was Miles Johnson. Yes. Again, he has some great programs. He even launched a program to inspire, you know, black teenagers to work in STEM, and he's doing a great. He's using his platform as a basketball player, a high major basketball player in the era of NIL. He's using his platform to do a lot of good and to really, you know, open up new paths that just weren't there for him when he got into college.
Yeah, and that's definitely a cool story right there too, especially with the impact that NIL is having, and even just you know, let the OFPs know that there are those opportunities out there for, you know, NIL, or for you to, you know, manage a student athlete and their NIL journey, and just knowing that, hey, you know, like, they're still going to school, they're still students, and maybe they're using what they're studying in school as an advantage to help start their businesses. Because, yeah, and I think that was one of the beauties of the NIL deal being sworn in by the NCAA, is that, you know, people probably thought, like, oh, you know, like, these student athletes, like, they're gonna, you know, make all this money and probably blow it and not know how to use it. But, you know, if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, you know, there's still, you know, like there's athletes that are actually using the NIL deal to their advantage for what they maybe want if they don't go pro in sports. And I feel like when we talk about college basketball, you know, because the one and done rule, I don't know what your opinions are about it, Thomas, but the one and done rule to me is kind of a waste if you think about it.
It is kind of a waste, and I think that was a product of the NBA's rulings that a player has to play a year in college. If you remember 15 years ago, guys like Dwight Howard coming out of high school, guys like LeBron, of course, that's the one, you know, of course, case that we know of where a player is an instant star out of high school and he's able to just go immediately straight to the NBA. I agree. You know, the one and done rule, especially in the age of NIL and in the age of all of these different avenues opening up, it's a bit of a waste. It is. And, you know, for a player, if you want to say, for example, a guy like Zion Williamson, I remember all of the hype even in high school. Like, this is not even just counting the year that he played at Duke that was just absolutely insane. He was a megastar even in high school. You couldn't avoid the Ball is Life mixtapes that he had, all the dunks that he had over poor little 5'8" kids in South Carolina. Right. But he was a megastar, and I definitely think that in 2018, he could have definitely went number one overall if he immediately went from high school to the NBA. And you have to also think just, potentially how perilous that could have been for him, because remember that game against Duke and UNC at Cameron Indoor Stadium where he hurt his ankle a minute into the game. And this was at the time where there was no NIL. Right. NIL was not allowed at all. So he was basically not playing with any compensation, no guarantees of, hey, I can make money off of my name.
And it possibly could have hurt his chances.
It could have hurt his chances. That's most importantly.
Too.
It could have hurt his chances of going to the NBA. Fortunately, he wasn't hurt. Of course, he's dealing with some other injuries as well. But, that just kind of shows you where that kind of situation can crop up and ruin a player's chances of going to the league when that hurdle doesn't exactly need to exist. I mean, if you want to look at let's look, for example, for other sports. You want to look at the NHL. Players can immediately go up from their semi-pro team or, I believe the U.S. national team, they have their own kind of development program where players can graduate from immediately when they're like 17 or 18. They're able to just make the jump immediately. In soccer, players can go through the youth academy and they can become pros as early as 16 years old, which is insane to think about. But that avenue is there for players that want it. And I think it's with the way the NBA is nowadays, with the globalization of the game and how many different players of different backgrounds are going to have different ways of coming up through the ranks and being able to get to the NBA, how we still kind of have this antiquated rule in place for one and dones. And, of course, we've seen Adam Silver make the discussions about changing those rules. But, I mean, I think it's a little bit too late now. I think he needs to be getting those rules in place now. Again, of course, you want to think about the players that are ready to play out of high school. The case might be like, well, a lot of these players just aren't ready out of high school. But, what about the players that are? Guys like Zion Williamson. Guys like LeBron, of course, who had – imagine if he went one and done, of course, going to Ohio State. Sure, that would be very cool to see how that plays out in 2003. But, you're also running the risk of that situation where what if he gets hurt in a college game where he's not being paid and ruining his chances of playing in the NBA? That could happen. And for a lot of students, a lot of people – once they graduate out of high school, some people, they don't want to deal with high school. And I'm speaking normally, for us, regular civilians and not people who are 6'8" and have a 40-inch vertical. Some people, say if they're done with high school, they say, hey, I don't want to college is not really for me. I want to go into a trade school or, I want to do an apprenticeship or something like that. That avenue is there for them. So I don't know why the same can't be said for the NBA.
Right. And I did actually do an episode on this. Make sure to go check out the last episode I did. I talked about the landscape of amateur basketball and talked about, just the exposure that high school kids get and even, the advantages that they'll have in college and even just this dynamic of how the pro draft or their route to the pros is working now. So I definitely highly recommend you to go check out the episode if you want. But, yeah, Thomas does bring up a great point there. And we're actually gotta wrap up now because got another show coming up. But Thomas, definitely awesome for you to come in, talk March Madness, and talk about this. It was
a pleasure to come on, Phil, to talk about this. A lot of the dynamics of the college game and where we are right now at St. John's. Yeah, it's going to be very, very promising, interesting times for St. John's. I shouldn't just say promising, very promising times for St. John's.
Yeah, and as always, I like to end the episodes off talking about sports jobs of the week. So since we talked a lot about college, kind of want to keep it college. So right now on Teamwork Online, there's a position open at University of Arizona. These are entry-level They're looking for an annual giving coordinator. So anybody that's interested in doing that, you can find out on Teamwork Online. There's also a position open. I saw another one here. UCLA. They have a position open for a travel operations coordinator. So anybody that works in travel or has some experience in doing that or wants to get that experience, definitely check that out. Also on Teamwork Online. And I'm going to give you guys one more. Let's see here. The Orange Bowl committee. So yeah, Orange Bowl, like one of the big college football bowl games around. They were actually a former FBS bowl game, and they have a position open right now. Actually, have two positions open. They're looking for a 2023-24 ticket sales executive for inside sales, and they're also looking for a communications and digital media coordinator. As of now, you can find all of it on Teamwork Online. But yeah, that's it. Well, we got to wrap up. But again, thank you all for tuning in to the Off Field Players podcast, and for Thomas Cavanagh being my guest in. Just want to say take care, stay safe, and stay positive. And as always, make sure to achieve what you believe.